Films in Focus with David Sterritt is underwritten by The Movie House, your destination for first-run Hollywood and independent movies, and a digital portal to the Met Opera, National Theater Live, and special events worldwide in Millerton, New York, and on the web, themoviehouse.net.
David Sterritt is the editor-in-chief for the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, contributing writer at Cineast, film professor at the Maryland Institute College of Art, Robin Hood Radio's very own critic. He joins us weekly. The films, The French Dispatch, Speer Goes to Hollywood, and The Rescue. And as I already said, that's a sentence with a little punctuation. Sounds very, very intriguing. How are you?
Yeah, doing okay, Jill. How you doing this week?
Refuse, I say, to complain.
All righty. Well, I won't try to talk you into it.
Okay.
But I'm very glad that you're doing very well. And yeah, we have 3 films today, as we so often do, and 2 of them are documentaries. But let's start off with the one that is not a documentary. And it is very much not a documentary. It is very much a fiction, and a very sort of distinctive one at that, The French Dispatch. The French Dispatch is the latest movie from Wes Anderson, and he has just such a huge following, especially among movie buffs and cinephiles. He is a very independent filmmaker, and he has such a distinctive visual approach to his movies. I'm just going to give a few titles here in case people don't recognize his name. Rushmore, The Royal Tenenbaums, they were a couple of his early major films. Fantastic Mr. Fox, which was an animation. Moonrise Kingdom, The Grand Budapest Hotel. Anyway, those are just a few of his films. And Wes Anderson has a very distinctive visual style. And I have to give him credit for that. I'm not going to give a very favorable review to The French Dispatch. I got to signal that right now. But I have to give him credit for having a visual style that you can recognize from about a million miles away. Oh, there it is. You see that little speck over in the distance? That's a frame from a Wes Anderson film, I can tell. Like maybe somebody like Orson Welles has a style that distinctive, but not many directors do. And he really, really, really does. Above all, I would say he loves symmetries. His frames are just composed in this perfect composition. They're composed in this perfect arrangement every time, and usually with these symmetries with the right and the left balanced perfectly, and something elegantly right in the center of the frame. He loves pastel colors. He loves things like that. So that's his visual style. And then he also has, an interesting way of working with actors who give these sort of, in many of his films, sort of slightly stylized performances. Nobody is going in either the visual style or the performances going for what you'd call like realism with an uppercase R. It's all very, very, very punctiliously, meticulously, immaculately done. Now, again, there are people who just love this, who just love his style, who love his approach, who love his way of doing these things. To my mind, one of the effects of all these things I've been mentioning, the slightly stylized performances, the immaculately perfect compositions, and the delicate little pastel colors, is that it drains every shred of spontaneity out of his movies. I like a sense that things are really happening up there, that there's some energy in the moment on the screen. And I do not sense that in Wes Anderson movies, and that is my argument with him. So I've just been talking about the style of this movie so much. Let's talk about what The French Dispatch is about. It's about several things, actually. The basic conceit of it is that there is a magazine called The French Dispatch, and for some reason it's published by, this is all sort of explained in the movie in a perfunctory way, it's published by a newspaper in Kansas, but it's sort of, it is in fact full of articles and stories about France, about this particular part of France. And so what we have here are several little movies all joined into this one big movie, The French Dispatch, which are, it's a movie of sketches. It's a movie that has 4 or 5 little sketches in it, and the whole thing totals well under 2 hours. So we're kind of dealing with little stories that don't particularly come to any big resolution, just sort of one little sketch, one little story after another, and they deal with different subjects. There's about an artist and somebody who's in a prison, or maybe it's an asylum. It seems to be both, and this and that and the other thing. Now, one of the other things I want to mention about The French Dispatch is the cast of it. A while back, Wes Anderson made a little video to publicize the movie, I looked at it a while back, and when it was going through the cast of the movie, I started to think maybe this was a joke, because it seemed like every single actor in the whole world who you've ever heard of is in this movie. I'm just going to give a tiny little sampling here. Benicio del Toro, Adrian Brody, Tilda Swinton, Léa Seydoux, Frances McDormand, Timothy Chalamet, Jeffrey Wright, Mathieu Almeric, Bill Murray, Owen Wilson, Bob Balaban, Henry Winkler, Lois Smith. It goes on and on and on. There they all are, especially the big sort of independent actors of today's world, such as the inevitable Bill Murray, who's in every single movie like this that comes along. Now, these are gifted people, but again, to my way of thinking, Wes Anderson doesn't really give them leeway to do what they do best. They're all giving what I've already called these slightly stylized performances. They're all being cute. They're all being entertaining. It's very nice to see Willem Dafoe showing up, because I really admire him enormously as an actor, but then he's on the screen for about 3.5 minutes out of the whole movie, and all he's doing are these sort of cute little things. So there are people who love The French Dispatch. There are people who love all Wes Anderson movies. I like his work from time to time, but The French Dispatch just gave me a pain right from the beginning, and it stayed that way all the way through. It has its moments, it has its little charms, and above all, it has this distinctive style with the symmetrical compositions and the little pastel colors. But again, I didn't sense any spontaneity in it at all, and by that I mean any real life in it at all. It's just all too crisp and perfect in its own little immaculately composed way. So by all means, everybody who loves Wes Anderson's work should run off and see The French Dispatch instantly. It didn't do very much for me, I'm afraid. So now, having gotten that done, let's go to some documentaries here, some real-life stuff. Although in each case, the documentary, that word documentary, has to be qualified a little bit, because they're not exactly pure documentaries, whatever that would be. Speer Goes to Hollywood has a really interesting subject to it. Yes, it is about Albert Speer, the architect of the Nazi Thousand-Year Reich. The one who Hitler brought in, and this is all covered in the movie. It's very interesting as a history lesson, to design buildings and design rallies and just design magnificent things that would make the Thousand-Year Reich look like it was actually going to last 1,000 years. Of course, it only lasted a handful of years. But anyway, that's who the Albert Speer is, and this is a documentary very much about Albert Speer. So there we have it, and he was brought in by Hitler, and he designed all these buildings, and he was right at Hitler's side, and he just did all these big things in the Nazi regime. He did not he was convicted in the famous Nuremberg trials, but he, of course, was not executed. He was sent off to prison, and as we see in the movie, after a lot of years in prison, he came out and went on to live apparently a pretty contented life after that. And that's what this movie is really about, and that's why it's called Speer Goes to Hollywood. He wrote a memoir, and his memoir was published in 1970 when he was out of his 20 years in jail for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then the idea came up, well, let's make this memoir, let's make it into a movie. So that's where the title Speer Goes to Hollywood comes from. He got together with a sometime filmmaker named Andrew Birkin, who had been a protege of the great, magnificent filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. And Andrew Birkin and Albert Speer worked for quite a long while on this project of making Speer's memoir of his Nazi years and his Nazi activities and his Nazi accomplishments, making this into a movie, into a Hollywood movie. And that's what this movie that we're talking about now is all about. So the idea was that, Albert Speer wanted his memoir to be made into a Hollywood movie, and he found this young, interested, and apparently talented young collaborator to work with him on it. So, of course, a whole lot of this movie involves Speer trying to make not exactly apologies for, but to justify the things he did during the Third Reich, and to claim that he wasn't really all that important, and to claim that he wasn't really always helping Hitler out all the time. Of course, he absolutely was. So a lot of the movie has to do with that. But more interestingly, at least from my point of view, a lot of it really has to do with this whole idea of how could this have been? How could this guy, having been a key participant in the most horrifying crime, certainly of the 20th century, and one of the most horrifying crimes of any century ever, how could he have ever thought that his memoir could be made into a Hollywood movie. How could somebody else, apparently a person of intelligence, have gone along with this project? And might it ever have actually come off? Well, it never did come off. The movie was never made. They had one of the big Hollywood studios really interested in it for a while, but then they said, nah, let's not do that. What the most important resource of the movie, Speer Goes to Hollywood, and I haven't mentioned, by the way, but it was made by a filmmaker named Vanessa Lapa. One of the most interesting resources that it has are audio recordings of conversations between Speer and others, and particularly between Speer and this young filmmaker, Andrew Birkin, who was working with him on the project. And there also are conversations with the very great filmmaker Carol Reed, who was sort of called up on the phone as a consultant on this from time to time. He was very skeptical about the project, but he certainly consulted on it for a while. So the thing is that you find out at the end of the movie, if you're paying attention to the credits, you find out that not all of these audio recordings that we're hearing are authentic. Andrew Birkin and Albert Speer tape recorded, we are told, and I'm sure this is accurate, hours and hours and hours of their consultations, of their story sessions, of their just conferences on maybe getting this movie made. And we think we are hearing those actual recordings when a lot of the time we are hearing recreations of those recordings done by actors later on. Apparently the audio quality of the recordings wasn't good enough. I don't think that disqualifies Speer Goes to Hollywood as an actual documentary. In fact, it doesn't disqualify it in my way of thinking. But it really does make the thing a little bit less than totally authentic, and I really wish that the filmmakers were more honest in letting us know about this at the very beginning, instead of letting us find out at the end, if we're paying attention, that some of this stuff we've been listening to with such fascination was actually recreated. I'm sure the recreations are very careful and true to the originals, but they are recreations, and that, again, just reduces the authenticity of the whole thing a little bit more, or a little bit. Other than that, very, very interesting movie. I was quite fascinated by it. Who ever thought that Albert Speer would have thought he could get a Hollywood movie made about him? A celebratory Hollywood movie based on his own version of events. Interesting to find that out, and the movie tells that story in an interesting way. Speer Goes to Hollywood, interesting documentary. And our final movie today, The Rescue. This is really, really interesting. The Rescue is a very, very on-target account of something that really, really happened a few years ago, and that was that there was a football team in Thailand who got trapped inside a flooded cave. There they were in this cave. The rains came early. The cave was totally flooded, and all of these people, about a dozen people, most of them young kids, were trapped deep in this cave behind all this water, and the world found out about it, and the idea came that these kids had to be rescued. So, of course, you bring in people who are good at doing daring things requiring enormous physical skill and courage. This was in Thailand, so the Thai Navy SEALs were brought in. They could not do it. They could not figure out how to rescue these kids and their coach trapped deep inside this cave. Somebody had the bright idea of calling in a couple of people from Britain, middle-aged guys who are hobbyists, who swim around in flooded caves just for fun. And it's so interesting to hear they're talking about this. One of them says, I really like it when I'm inside a cave in the middle of the water, deep under the earth, in my scuba gear, because my time's my own and nobody bothers me and nobody gets in my way. Anyway, these are basically hobbyists, people who swim around in caves in dark water with flashlights just for fun. And they are brought in, and they really seem to know what they're doing, and they figure out how to rescue these young people. And again, this is not really a spoiler because all this was very much in the news when it was actually going on. The rescue does come off successfully, but oh my gosh, the story of how this was done is absolutely astounding. At one point, they had to bring in some consultation from a physician who counsels them into how to anesthetize the kids, because otherwise they will panic when they're being taken out of this flooded cave, being towed underwater with scuba masks on their faces. And there are so many ways in which this anesthesia project could go wrong and they could die. There's a list of ways. The physician says there's 100 ways in which they could die, and yet somehow they actually pull this off and it all works. Again, this is not entirely authentic stuff. Some of this rescue was recreated later on in a tank in a movie studio, but much of it is real, authentic footage from when this actually happened, and there's news footage and so forth that we see along the way. And even though you know how this is going to come out at the end, it's really just riveting and suspenseful every step of the way. It's not, are they going to get the kids out? It's, how are they going to do it? And oh my gosh, this seems impossible, but my gosh, they've just done it. And it's that sort of thing for the whole running time of the movie. So I found The Rescue just a really, really fascinating documentary, and I really recommend it to anybody who wants to see some good, suspenseful, real-life filmmaking. You can't really beat this movie for that. And so that is my somewhat documentary-style story this week, Jill.
Thank you, as ever, David Sterritt. Films in Focus, the films The French Dispatch, Speer Goes to Hollywood, and The Rescue.